The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor of Romano's Italian bistro with a sound that cut through the evening's gentle murmur like a blade through silk. Maya Rodriguez didn't flinch as the dark liquid splashed across her black sneakers, staining the worn fabric she'd scrubbed clean just that morning. She'd seen worse. She'd endured worse. But something in the way the man's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction made her stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with the 3 double shifts she'd worked this week. "Are you completely incompetent?" Marcus Thornfield's voice boomed across the restaurant, his perfectly tailored Armani suit a stark contrast to the warm, family-owned atmosphere Romanos had maintained for 37 years. Every conversation in the dining room had stopped. Silverware hung suspended mid-bite. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, the usual clatter of plates and sizzle of garlic replaced by the heavy weight of collective embarrassment. "I asked for my coffee black. Black means no cream, no sugar, no incompetence from some minimum wage nobody who clearly doesn't belong in an establishment that caters to people of substance." Maya's hands trembled as she knelt to pick up the ceramic shards, each piece reflecting the restaurant's soft amber lighting like fragments of broken dreams. She was 26 years old, a graduate of Columbia Business School, with a degree she'd earned through scholarships, student loans, and more all-nighters than she cared to count. But here, in her white button-down shirt, with the small Romano's logo embroidered above her heart, she was invisible. Just another face in the service industry, another person whose worth was measured in tips and table turnover rates. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "I'll bring you a fresh cup immediately." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile spreading across his face. He was the kind of man who wore his arrogance like cologne, too much of it, impossible to ignore, and suffocating to anyone forced to be near him. At 42, he'd inherited his position as CEO of Thornfield Industries from his father, and from his grandfather before that. His success was birthright, not earned, and he wielded that privilege like a weapon against anyone he deemed beneath his station. "You'll do more than that," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow felt louder than his shouting. "You'll grovel. You'll apologize properly, on your knees, and maybe I won't call your manager and have you fired for your obvious incompetence. Do you have any idea who I am, who you're dealing with?" The restaurant held its breath. Elderly Mrs. Chin, who came every Tuesday for the minestrone soup, clutched her napkin to her chest. The young couple on their anniversary date stared at their plates, too uncomfortable to continue their meal. Even Tony Romano himself, the 70-year-old owner who'd built this place from nothing, had emerged from the kitchen, his flour-dusted apron and weathered hands, telling the story of decades spent serving others with dignity and respect. Maya felt the weight of every gaze, but more than that, she felt the familiar burn of injustice that had followed her through childhood, through college, through every moment when someone had tried to make her feel small because of where she came from, how much money her family had, or what job she happened to be working to survive. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Mija, the world will try to break your spirit. Don't let them. Your worth isn't determined by their ignorance." She stood slowly, the ceramic pieces carefully arranged in her palm, and looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thornfield." And for the first time that evening, her voice carried something stronger than deference. "But I think you might be surprised to learn who I am." Marcus's laugh was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against stone. "Oh, this should be rich. Please enlighten me. What could you possibly be besides a waitress who can't follow simple instructions?" The leather portfolio sat in Maya's locker, tucked away with her car keys and the photo of her late mother that she carried everywhere. Inside that portfolio were documents that would change everything. Documents she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to review them properly, to understand the full scope of what her mother's passing had left her. She'd been too busy working, too exhausted from grief, too overwhelmed by the responsibility of paying for a funeral she couldn't afford, to sit down with her mother's lawyer and process the inheritance beyond the small apartment and few personal belongings she'd expected. But standing here, watching this man's cruelty radiate through a room full of good people just trying to enjoy their evening, she felt something crystallize in her chest, a knowing, a certainty that arrived like lightning, illuminating everything that had been hidden in shadow. "Clean this mess up," Marcus continued, gesturing dismissively at the spilled coffee. "And when you're done, you can tell your boss that his staff needs better training. In fact, maybe I'll speak to him himself. Romano's, right? I'm sure I can find better uses for this property than some family restaurant that clearly can't maintain proper service standards." Tony Romano's face went pale. Maya had heard the rumors, the whispered conversations between employees about rising rent, about corporate interests circling the neighborhood like vultures. Romano's sat on prime real estate, a corner location that had been grandfathered into a rent control agreement that expired at the end of the year. Without that protection, the family business that had served 3 generations of customers would become just another casualty of gentrification. "Please, sir," Tony said, his accented English thick with worry. "Maya's good girl, hard worker. She make mistake, but she learn. You no need to make trouble for us." Marcus turned his predatory smile toward the older man, and Maya saw something shift in his expression, the look of a hunter who just spotted fresh prey. "Trouble? Oh, Mr. Romano, you haven't seen trouble yet. I'm Marcus Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Industries. We own half the buildings in this district, and I personally oversee our real estate acquisitions. When your lease comes up for renewal, you might find that the market rate for this location has increased substantially." The threat hung in the air like smoke, choking and bitter. Maya watched Tony's shoulders sag, saw the dreams of a lifetime crumbling behind his kind eyes. She thought of her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to put food on their table, who'd died at 53 from a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork and the constant weight of financial insecurity. She thought of every person who'd ever looked at her uniform instead of her education, her job instead of her character, her circumstances instead of her potential. The ceramic pieces in her palm had edges sharp enough to cut, but Maya held them gently, the way she'd learned to hold everything fragile in her life. She thought about her mother's final words in the hospital. "I saved everything I could for you, mija. Use it well. Make them remember that we were here." "Mr. Thornfield," Maya said, and her voice carried a new quality now, something that made Marcus stop mid-gesture toward his phone. "I think there's something you should know before you make any more threats." The man's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Oh, and what would that be, sweetheart?" Maya smiled, and for the first time since the coffee cup had shattered, she felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. 3 weeks ago, my mother passed away. Carmen Rodriguez. You might not recognize the name, but you should. She was your father's business partner back when Thornfield Industries was just a small construction company struggling to survive the recession of 1987. The color began to drain from Marcus's face, but Maya continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "She provided the capital that saved your family's business when the banks wouldn't lend to you. In return, she became a 51% silent partner with shares that passed to her heirs upon her death. Shares that, according to the documents I haven't had time to properly review until now, make me the majority owner of Thornfield Industries." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles went white. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The company is privately held, family-owned. There are no outside shareholders." Maya's smile widened, and she could see her mother in it, the same quiet strength that had carried them through years of struggle, the same dignity that had never bent even under the weight of prejudice and poverty. "That's what your father wanted you to believe," she said softly. "But the truth has a way of coming to light, doesn't it? Just like the truth about how you treat people you think are beneath you." She turned toward Tony, whose eyes were wide open with wonder and something that might have been hope. "Mr. Romano, I think there's something we should discuss about some changes to your lease agreement, something more permanent and definitely more fair." Marcus Thornfield sat frozen, his threats hanging in the air like popped balloons, deflated and powerless. Around him, the restaurant began to come alive again, conversations resuming with an undercurrent of excitement, the clatter of silverware against plates resuming like applause. But Maya Rodriguez stood in the center of it all, ceramic pieces still in her palm, coffee still staining her sneakers, and felt the weight of her mother's sacrifice finally settling in to something that looked remarkably like justice. The real question now was what she would do with the power she'd just discovered, and whether Marcus Thornfield was prepared for the reckoning that was about to reshape everything he thought he knew about his world. The apartment above Romano's bakery had been Maya's sanctuary for the past 8 months, ever since her medical bills had forced her to give up the small 2-bedroom they'd shared in Queens. The narrow stairs creaked with each step, a wooden symphony that had become as familiar as her own. Heartbeat. At 5:47 a.m., she climbed those stairs with the weight of yesterday's revelation still heavy on her shoulders, her mind spinning between disbelief and a growing sense of responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. The legal document spread across her kitchen table told a story she was still learning to read. Her mother's neat handwriting filled the margins of contracts dated back to 1987, notes about meetings and decisions and sacrifices made for a future Carmen Rodriguez had never lived to see. The partnership agreement was thick with legal language, but the core truth was undeniable. Thornfield Industries, the multi-million-dollar real estate empire that had been terrorizing small businesses across the city, belonged to her. Maya made coffee in the small French press her mother had given her for graduation, the one luxury Carmen had insisted they could afford, because education and good coffee are the only investments that always pay dividends, mija. The ritual grounded her, the familiar motions of measuring grounds and timing the steep, helping to organize thoughts that felt too large for her small kitchen, too complex for her 26 years of life experience. Her phone buzzed with messages she wasn't ready to answer. Marcus Thornfield had called 17 times since she'd left the restaurant, his voicemails escalating from confused to angry to what sounded suspiciously like panic. Her mother's lawyer, David Kim, had left 3 messages asking her to call immediately. Even Tony Romano had somehow gotten her number, his broken English made even more fractured by excitement as he thanked her over and over for what she might be able to do for his family business. But Maya sat at her table, surrounded by papers that represented power she'd never asked for, and felt the familiar weight of being caught between worlds. She thought about her childhood, about the way her mother had cleaned office buildings at night so Maya could attend the good school district during the day, about scholarship interviews where she'd learned to code switch, to make her voice smaller and her dreams more palatable to people who held her future in their hands, about the way she'd perfected the art of being grateful for opportunities that should have been rights, of smiling through condescension that cut like glass. The photograph of her mother sat propped against the sugar bowl, Carmen's warm smile radiating the same strength that had carried them through evictions and utility shutoffs and medical bankruptcies. Maya had inherited her mother's eyes, dark and expressive, holding depths that people often underestimated. But where Carmen had channeled her strength into quiet perseverance, Maya had always felt a restlessness, a burning need to push back against systems designed to keep her small. Her Columbia Business School degree hung on the wall, the frame slightly crooked because she'd never gotten around to hanging it properly. 3 years out of school, and she'd been rejected from dozens of corporate positions, told she was overqualified for entry-level work but lacked the cultural fit for higher positions. The coded language was familiar by now.
She was too much for some spaces, not enough for others, always somehow wrong for the rooms where decisions were made and fortunes were built. So she'd waited tables and tended bar and worked retail jobs that paid her bills while she waited for the break that never came. She'd saved every penny she could, sending money home to help with her mother's medical expenses, watching her dreams of making a difference get smaller and smaller until they fit into the margins of other people's expectations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now sitting on the exact kind of power she'd been seeking her entire adult life. Power that had literally fallen into her lap through tragedy and hidden truths. But with power came responsibility, and Maya felt the weight of every decision that would flow from this moment. How many people worked for Thornfield Industries? How many families depended on paychecks signed by Marcus's arrogance? How many small businesses like Romano's had been crushed under the company's aggressive expansion? She thought about Marcus's face when she'd revealed the truth, the way his certainty had crumbled into confusion and fear. Part of her, the part that still carried every slight and dismissal she'd ever endured, felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing him knocked off balance. But a larger part felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what came next. Corporate warfare wasn't the same as serving tables or balancing budgets on minimum wage. The decisions she made in the coming days would ripple through lives she'd never met, communities she'd never seen. Her phone rang again, David Kim's name flashing on the screen. This time she answered. "Maya, thank God." The lawyer's voice was tight with professional concern. "I've been trying to reach you since last night. We need to talk immediately." "I know," Maya said, her voice still rough with sleep and emotion. "I've been reading through everything. Is it real? The partnership agreement, the ownership structure, is it actually legal?" "It's not just legal, it's ironclad," David replied, and she could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Your mother was incredibly careful about protecting her investment. She insisted on specific language that would prevent the Thornfield family from diluting her shares or buying her out without consent. She essentially built a fortress around her ownership stake."
"But there's something else you need to know," David continued, his voice dropping. "Marcus Thornfield filed an emergency injunction this morning challenging the validity of the partnership agreement. He's claiming fraud, duress, and mental incompetence on his father's part. He's hired Brennan Walsh and Associates. They're the best corporate litigation firm in the city." The coffee in Maya's cup had gone cold, but she took a sip anyway, needing something to do with her hands while her mind processed this new reality. Of course Marcus wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Men like him never did. They wrapped their entitlement in legal language and expensive suits, but underneath it was always the same story. The belief that the world owed them everything and they owed the world nothing. "How strong is his case?" she asked. "Weak on the facts, but backed by unlimited resources," David said honestly. "The documentation is solid, but litigation is expensive and time-consuming. He's betting that you don't have the financial resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. Most people in your position would be forced to settle for a fraction of what they're owed." Maya thought about her savings account, 3 months of rent and utilities if she was careful. She thought about student loans that wouldn't pause just because she'd inherited a fortune she couldn't access. She thought about all the ways the system was designed to protect people like Marcus and exhaust people like her, grinding them down with procedures and delays and costs until they gave up their rights just to survive. "What would my mother do?" she asked, more to herself than to David. "From what I knew of Carmen, she'd fight," the lawyer said softly, "but she'd also be smart about it. She didn't get where she got by charging headfirst into battles she couldn't win." After hanging up, Maya sat in the growing morning light, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam that slanted through her kitchen window. The city was waking up around her, traffic increasing on the street below, the scent of fresh bread rising from Romano's bakery, the familiar sounds of a neighborhood beginning another day. In a few hours, she'd need to go downstairs and start her shift, serving coffee and taking orders and pretending that her world hadn't fundamentally shifted in the space of a single conversation. But first, she needed to understand exactly what her mother had built and what it would take to protect it. She pulled her laptop toward her and began to research, diving into Thornfield Industries' corporate structure, their holdings, their business practices. What she found made her stomach turn. The company owned 47 residential buildings across Manhattan and Brooklyn, most of them rent-stabilized properties that housed working families, elderly tenants on fixed incomes, and small business owners who'd been part of their neighborhoods for decades. Over the past 5 years, under Marcus's leadership, Thornfield Industries had systematically driven out long-term tenants through harassment, selective maintenance neglect, and aggressive rent increases. They've evicted elderly residents who couldn't fight back, displaced immigrant families who didn't know their rights, and shuttered small businesses that couldn't afford market-rate rents. The pattern was clear and calculated. Buy buildings with vulnerable tenants, make their lives miserable until they moved out, then renovate and rent at luxury prices. It was legal, technically, but it was destroying communities that had taken generations to build. Maya recognized the strategy because she'd lived through it. The phone calls from landlords, the sudden repair issues that never got fixed, the feeling of being unwanted in your own home until leaving felt like the only option. She thought about Marcus's threat to Tony Romano, the casual way he'd wielded his power over a man who'd spent his life serving others with dignity and respect. How many other small business owners had heard similar threats? How many families had been forced to leave neighborhoods where their children had grown up, where their grandparents were buried, where their dreams had taken root? By the time Maya closed her laptop, her course was clear. This wasn't just about legal ownership or corporate control. This was about the kind of person she wanted to be, the kind of world she wanted to help build. Her mother had sacrificed for 37 years to give her this opportunity. The question now was whether she had the strength to honor that sacrifice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been crushed under the weight of Marcus Thornfield's ambition. She looked at her work uniform hanging on the back of her chair, the white shirt and black pants that had become like armor, protecting her real self from the assumptions and judgments of customers who saw only what they expected to see. Today, she'd wear that uniform one more time, but she'd wear it as the majority owner of Thornfield Industries, as the daughter of Carmen Rodriguez, as someone who'd learned that sometimes the most radical act was refusing to disappear. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m. sharp in the 42nd floor conference room of the Thornfield Industries Tower. Maya had never been inside the building before, despite the fact that she now technically owned 51% of it. Standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the gleaming glass and steel monument to corporate power, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with entering spaces where she wasn't supposed to belong. David Kim met her in the lobby, his usually calm demeanor betrayed by the tension around his eyes. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked as they walked toward the elevator bank. Marcus had had 3 days to prepare, and he's not going to make this easy.
Maya smoothed down her best dress, a navy blue suit she'd bought for job interviews that never led to offers. It was professional, but not expensive, confident, but not aggressive, the kind of careful balance she'd perfected over years of trying to be just right for rooms that never quite made space for her. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I just didn't know it yet." The elevator rose smoothly, carrying them past floors of offices where hundreds of people worked to build Marcus Thornfield's vision of progress, a vision that seemed to require the destruction of everything that had come before. Maya thought about the research she'd done over the past 3 days, the interviews she'd conducted with former tenants, the documentation she'd gathered of the company's systematic displacement of vulnerable communities. Mrs. Elena Vasquez,
83 years old, had lived in the same Brighton Beach apartment for 47 years before Thornfield Industries bought her building. Within 6 months, her heat started failing in winter, her sink backed up repeatedly, and strangers began showing up at her door offering cash for her lease. When she refused to move, her rent was raised by 400%. She'd been living in a studio in Queens now for 2 years, far from the community center where she'd volunteered, the bodega where the owner knew her by name, the neighbors who'd become family. Carlos Mendoza had run a small auto repair shop in Washington Heights for 15 years, building a customer base that trusted him with their cars and their stories. When Thornfield Industries bought the building, his rent tripled overnight. The new lease came with restrictions that made it impossible to operate. No noise after 6 p.m., no overnight parking for customer vehicles, no signage visible from the street. Carlos had closed the shop last month and was now working as a mechanic for someone else. His dreams of building a business to pass to his sons reduced to memories and debt. These weren't abstract business decisions or market forces. They were people's lives, communities, dreams ground up in the machinery of Marcus Thornfield's ambition. Maya carried their stories with her as the elevator climbed, each floor marking another level of remove from the street-level reality of what corporate decisions actually meant. The conference room was exactly what she'd expected. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that reduced millions of lives to a beautiful abstraction. Marcus sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 lawyers and 2 men in identical gray suits who had the look of professional intimidators. He'd regained his composure since their encounter at Romano's, his expression carefully neutral except for the cold calculation in his eyes. "Miss Rodriguez," he said as she entered, not bothering to stand. "How good of you to join us. I trust you've had time to reconsider your claims." Maya took the seat directly across from him, David settling beside her with his briefcase full of documents and decades of careful legal preparation. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the barely concealed hostility of men who saw her as an interloper, an inconvenience to be managed and dismissed. "I've had time to do my homework," she replied, evenly, but carrying an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "About the company, about its business practices, and exactly how much damage you've done to communities across this city." Marcus's lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and the kind of expensive watch that cost more Maya made in a year, leaned forward with a condescending smile. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm Robert Brennan. I represent Mr. Thornfield and Thornfield Industries. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about your mother's relationship with this company." He slid a folder across the table toward her, thick with documents and official-looking seals. "These are the original incorporation papers, the complete shareholder registry, and certified statements from every board member going back to the company's founding. As you can see, there is no record of any partnership with Carmen Rodriguez. No stock certificates, no voting rights, no legal claim to ownership of any kind." Maya opened the folder, her eyes scanning documents that told a very different story from the papers her mother had left her. According to these records, Thornfield Industries had always been wholly owned by the Thornfield family, with no outside investors or silent partners. The documentation was thorough, professional, and completely false. "Impressive," she said, closing the folder and meeting Brennan's eyes directly. "How long did it take you to manufacture all of this?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's carefully neutral expression cracked just enough to show the fury underneath. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Rodriguez. Are you suggesting that we've falsified corporate records?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Maya replied, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "I'm stating a fact. These documents are fabrications, created to cover up the legitimate partnership agreement my mother signed with your father in 1987. The question is whether you're doing this knowingly or whether you've been lied to your entire life about how your family's fortune was actually built." She reached into her own briefcase and withdrew a different set of documents, ones that had been stored in a safety deposit box for 37 years, waiting for this moment. The partnership agreement was yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, signed by both Carmen Rodriguez and Marcus's father, witnessed by 2 lawyers, and notarized with seals that predated modern forgery techniques. Your father was facing bankruptcy when the savings and loan crisis hit, Maya continued, sliding copies of the agreement across the table to each person in the room. The company had over-leveraged itself on a series of construction projects that went bad. The banks wouldn't extend his credit, his investors had pulled out, and he had 60 days before the company would be dissolved. Marcus's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Even if that were true, which I'm not admitting, business partnerships from 40 years ago don't automatically transfer ownership to heirs. They do when they're structured the way your mother was smart enough to structure them. David Kim spoke for the first time, his quiet authority filling the room. Carmen Rodriguez didn't just provide capital, she provided a lifeline. And she made sure that lifeline came with permanent protections. He distributed another set of documents, these ones bearing the seal of the New York State Department of Corporations. The partnership was registered with the state, with specific succession clauses that transfer ownership to designated heirs upon death of the original partner. These aren't internal corporate records that can be altered or misplaced. They're part of the public record, backed up in multiple government databases. Maya watched as the lawyers huddled together, whispering frantically as they compared the documents. She could see the moment when they realized the truth, when the careful edifice of denial and misdirection began to crumble under the weight of documented reality. But Marcus wasn't finished fighting. If anything, the confirmation of Maya's claims seemed to energize him, bringing out the vicious core that had been hiding under his corporate polish. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Let's say for argument's sake that your mother did have some kind of business relationship with my father 40 years ago. Let's say there was money involved and maybe even some kind of informal partnership. That doesn't give you the right to walk into a successful company and start making demands." He stood up, pacing to the window as if the view of the city below belonged to him personally. "Do you have any idea what you're playing with here? Thornfield Industries employs over 800 people. We manage properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We're responsible for housing thousands of tenants, for commercial spaces that support hundreds of small businesses. And you want to disrupt all of that because of some 40-year-old piece of paper? I want to change the way this company operates, because the current approach is destroying the very communities you claim to be serving." She opened her laptop and projected a presentation onto the conference room's smart screen, images filling the wall-mounted display that told the story of Thornfield Industries' real impact. Before and after photos of buildings that had been allowed to deteriorate until tenants fled. Eviction notices served to families who'd lived in their apartments for decades. Gentrification maps that showed how the company's acquisitions created spreading zones of displacement and cultural erasure. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, 74 years old, lived in the same Lower East Side apartment for 38 years. She raised 4 children in that apartment, survived her husband's death, built a community of neighbors who became family. When Thornfield Industries bought her building, her rent increased by 600%. She's now living in a senior facility in New Jersey, separated from everything and everyone she's ever known. Click. Another photo. This one of a small restaurant with papers taped to the windows. Miguel Santos owned Santos Family Restaurant for 22 years. 3 generations of his family worked there, serving authentic Dominican food to a neighborhood that watched his children grow up. Your company bought his building and raised his rent from $4,000 to $18,000 a month. The restaurant closed last week. Click. A photograph of a young mother holding a toddler, standing in front of a moving truck. Jennifer Kim, a nurse at Mount Sinai, was forced to move to Queens when her rent in Manhattan became unaffordable. She now commutes 3 hours a day to get to work, time she used to spend with her daughter. She's looking for a job closer to her new home, which means the hospital is losing an experienced healthcare worker just when they need them most. The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft whir of the projector.
Maya could see the discomfort in the faces around the table, the way people looked away from images that made their business decisions human and real. "This isn't progress," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each slide. "This is systematic displacement disguised as development. You're not creating value, you're extracting it from communities that took generations to build, concentrating wealth in the hands of people who have no connection to the neighborhoods they're destroying." Marcus slammed his hand against the window, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "You don't understand anything about business," he shouted, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "You think you can walk in here with your bleeding heart stories and your moral superiority and tell us how to run a company? You're a waitress. You serve coffee for a living. What do you know about real estate development, about market forces, about the complexities of urban planning?"
The insult hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Maya felt every person in the room waiting to see how she would respond. This was the moment Marcus had been building toward, the attempt to reduce her to her job, to make her small enough that her words would lose their power, her ownership would seem absurd. Maya smiled, and it was her mother's smile, patient and knowing and unbreakable. "You're right," she said. "I am a waitress. I serve coffee and take orders and clean up other people's messes. I work on my feet for 10 hours a day, I smile when customers are rude to me, and I go home with my back aching and my feet swollen because that's what honest work looks like." She walked closer to the window, close enough that she could see the reflection of both their faces in the glass, her steady gaze meeting his furious stare. "But being a waitress has taught me things you never learned in your corner office. It taught me that every person deserves dignity, regardless of how much money they have. It taught me that communities are built by people who show up every day, who take care of each other, who remember each other's names and stories. It taught me that real wealth isn't what you own, it's what you contribute." She turned back to face the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her power. "And it taught me that sometimes the people with the least to lose are the ones with the most courage to change things." The lawyers were whispering again, but Marcus wasn't listening to them. His face had gone red with rage, and Maya could see him struggling to find words that would restore his control over the situation. "You want to know what I know about business?" she continued, clicking to a new slide that showed Thornfield Industries' financial projections. "I know that your company's profit margins depend on keeping tenants desperate and small business owners powerless. I know that you've built a model that extracts maximum profit by externalizing all the social costs. And I know that it's not sustainable because communities that have been stripped of stability and affordability eventually become uninvestable." She clicked again, showing comparative data from other cities where similar displacement strategies had been tried. Detroit, Cleveland, parts of Chicago. When you push out everyone who can't afford luxury prices, you don't create thriving neighborhoods. You create empty buildings and dead commercial districts. The short-term profits you're extracting now are destroying the long-term value of the very properties you own. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound without humor. "So what's your grand plan, Ms. Rodriguez? Turn Thornfield Industries into a charity? Give away our properties to whoever has the saddest story? That's not how capitalism works." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that we run this company like we understand the difference between profit and plunder, that we develop properties in partnership with existing communities instead of displacing them, that we create housing and commercial spaces that working people can actually afford, that we measure success by the stability and prosperity of the neighborhoods we invest in, not just by quarterly earnings reports." She clicked to a final slide, showing examples of community-based development projects from around the country, affordable housing built in partnership with local organizations, commercial spaces designed to support small businesses,
renovation projects that preserved neighborhood character while improving living conditions. This isn't charity. It's smart business. It's building long-term value instead of quick profits. It's creating wealth that stays in communities instead of being extracted from them. And it's the direction this company is going to go because I'm not just the majority owner, I'm someone who's lived through what your business model does to real people. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her with something approaching hatred, while his lawyer shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. Finally, Robert Brennan cleared his throat. "Ms. Rodriguez, even if we were to accept the validity of your claims, which we are not prepared to do, you should understand that corporate ownership doesn't automatically translate to operational control. There are fiduciary responsibilities, regulatory requirements, existing contracts, and obligations that limit what any single shareholder can do." David Kim smiled for the first time that morning. "Actually, Mr. Brennan, you might want to read Section 12 of the partnership agreement more carefully. Carmen Rodriguez was very specific about operational control. As majority owner, Ms. Rodriguez has full authority to direct company policy, approve major expenditures, and replace executive leadership as she sees fit." Maya watched the blood drain from Marcus's face as the full implications hit him. This wasn't just about ownership. It was about power. Real, immediate, actionable power to change everything he'd built. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice hoarse with desperation. "This company is my life, my father's legacy, my grandfather's dream. You can't just walk in here and destroy everything we've built." "I'm not here to destroy anything," Maya said, gently, and for the first time that morning, her voice carried compassion instead of confrontation. "I'm here to honor what your grandfather actually built and what my mother helped him build. She told me stories about those early days, about the partnerships and community relationships that made this company successful. Your grandfather didn't get rich by displacing people. He got rich by housing them, by creating spaces where families and businesses could thrive. This is what I want to get back to. Development that serves communities instead of destroying them. Business that creates value for everyone, not just shareholders." Marcus followed her gaze to the photograph, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression, memory, perhaps, or regret. "My grandfather was a different man in a different time. The market doesn't reward sentiment anymore. If we don't maximize returns, our investors will find someone who will."
"Then maybe it's time to find different investors," Maya replied. "People who understand that sustainable business models produce better long-term returns than extraction-based ones. People who care about more than quarterly earnings." The meeting continued for another hour, with lawyers raising procedural objections and Marcus alternating between fury and desperate negotiation attempts. But the fundamental reality had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. Maya Rodriguez, the waitress who served coffee and cleaned up other people's messes, now controlled one of the most powerful real estate companies in New York City. As they finally filed out of the conference room, Marcus caught her arm at the elevator. His grip was tight enough to be uncomfortable, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he hissed. "Running a company like this isn't about good intentions and sob stories. There are contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, regulatory compliance issues that could shut us down, competitive pressures that require decisions you're not equipped to make. You'll destroy everything, and then you'll be left with nothing but the wreckage of your naivety." Maya gently removed his hand from her arm, her expression calm but unyielding. "Marcus, I've been dealing with powerful men who underestimate me my entire life. I've been threatened by landlords, dismissed by employers, talked down to by customers who thought my job made me less than human.
But I'm still here, and I'm still fighting. And now I have the resources to fight effectively. The elevator arrived, and she stepped inside, turning to face him one more time. You can work with me to transform this company into something that actually serves the communities we operate in, or you can fight me and lose everything anyway. But either way, things are going to change. The doors closed on his stunned expression, and Maya rode down 42 floors with David Kim, both of them silent as the weight of what had just happened settled around them. When they reached the lobby, Maya felt the familiar disorientation of moving between worlds, from the rarefied air of corporate power back to the street-level reality where her decisions would actually matter. Her phone was buzzing with messages from people who'd somehow already heard about the morning's events. Tony Romano had left 3 voicemails, his excitement barely contained as he thanked her for whatever she'd done to secure his lease. A reporter from the Village Voice wanted to interview her about community-based approaches to urban development. Even her old roommate from college had somehow heard the news and was calling to congratulate her. But the message that stopped her cold was from Elena Vasquez, the elderly woman who'd been forced out of her Brighton Beach apartment. Somehow, word had spread through networks Maya didn't even know existed. Tenant organizations, community groups, informal networks of people who looked out for each other because no one else would. Mija, Elena's voice was thick with her accent and trembling with emotion. I heard what you did today. I heard you stood up to those men and told them about people like me. I want you to know, your mama, she would be so proud of the woman you became. Maya sat on a bench outside the Thornfield Industries building, 42 stories of glass and steel rising above her, and felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She owned this now. Not just the building, not just the company, but the power to change hundreds of lives, to reshape dozens of communities, to either continue the cycle of displacement and extraction or build something entirely different. The afternoon sun slanted through the urban canyon, casting long shadows that stretched toward neighborhoods where people like Elena Vasquez were still fighting to stay in their homes, where small business owners like Miguel Santos were still losing their dreams to forces they couldn't control, where families like Jennifer Kim's were still being scattered by economic pressures that treated human communities like obstacles to profit. Maya thought about her mother, who'd cleaned those office buildings late at night so Maya could have opportunities she'd never imagined. Carmen had saved every penny, worked every overtime shift, sacrificed her own dreams so Maya could dream bigger. But even Carmen couldn't have imagined this, that her careful investment in a struggling young company would one day give Maya the power to reshape an entire industry. The real work was just beginning. Corporate ownership was one thing, but changing entrenched systems, rebuilding community trust, developing sustainable business models that served people instead of exploiting them, that would require everything Maya had learned about perseverance, about building coalitions, about finding strength in places where others saw only vulnerability.
She stood up, straightening her navy blue suit, and walked toward the subway station that would take her back to her neighborhood, back to Romano's restaurant, where she was still scheduled to work the evening shift. Tomorrow, she would begin the complex work of transforming Thornfield Industries. But tonight, she would serve coffee and take orders and listen to the stories of people who trusted her with their small moments of joy and frustration and hope. Because she was still a waitress, still someone who understood that real change happened in the daily interactions between people, in the accumulated small kindnesses and stubborn refusals to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The difference now was that she also owned the means to turn those small acts of resistance into systemic transformation. Marcus Thornfield had been right about one thing. Running a company like Thornfield Industries would require decisions she'd never been trained to make, navigation of systems she'd only seen from the outside. But he'd been wrong about what mattered most. The skills that had carried her through years of underestimation and struggle, the ability to see people's dignity even when they couldn't see it themselves, the commitment to showing up even when the work was thankless, the understanding that everyone's story mattered, those were exactly the skills she'd need to build something better. As the train pulled into the station, Maya Rodriguez, waitress and majority owner of Thornfield Industries, began planning the revolution she was going to lead with nothing but compassion, determination, and the unshakable belief that business could be a force for justice if it was run by people who remembered what justice actually looked like. The news broke on Friday morning, 3 days after the board meeting that had changed everything. Maya discovered it the way most people did, scrolling through her phone while drinking coffee in her small kitchen above Romano's bakery, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up around her, suddenly overwhelmed by the buzzing of notifications that wouldn't stop. "Local waitress inherits real estate empire," read the headline in the New York Post. The Daily News had gone with, "From tables to towers, server becomes CEO overnight." But it was the Village Voice that had gotten closest to the real story, the inheritance that could reshape gentrification in New York. Maya's phone rang before she could finish reading the first article. Unknown number, but she answered anyway, still trying to process seeing her own face staring at her from newspaper websites across the city. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News. We'd love to interview you about your plans for Thornfield Industries. Can you tell us about your background and how you intend to use this opportunity?" Before Maya could respond, another call was coming in, then another. By the time she turned her phone to silent mode, she had 17 missed calls from reporters, 3 from lawyers representing interested parties, and 1 from someone claiming to represent a documentary crew that wanted to follow her story. But it was the text message from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, that made her hands shake. "Mija, there are news trucks on our street. They're asking everyone about you. I told them you're a good girl who works hard, but they keep asking about money and what you're going to do with all that power. Are you okay?" Maya dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, intending to slip out the back entrance of Romano's to avoid whatever circus had apparently assembled on her street. But Tony Romano was waiting for her in the kitchen, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Maya, Madonna mia, you didn't tell me," he exclaimed, gesturing toward the front windows where she could see camera crews setting up equipment on the sidewalk. "All these years you work here, you help my family, and you never say nothing about being rich?" "I wasn't rich, Mr. Romano," Maya said gently. "I didn't even know about the inheritance until last week. I'm still the same person who's been serving your customers for 8 months." Tony's expression softened, and he placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Of course you are the same person, but now maybe you can help other people the way you help us. These reporters, they want to know what kind of person owns all those buildings now. I tell them you're the kind of person who stays late to help close the kitchen, who remembers every customer's order, who never makes anyone feel small." The back door opened and David Kim entered, looking harried and carrying what appeared to be an armload of legal documents. "Maya, we need to talk immediately. Marcus filed another injunction this morning and 3 different investment firms have made unsolicited offers to buy your shares. Plus, there's a tenant organization that wants to meet with you and a city councilman who's calling for a public hearing about Thornfield Industries' business practices." Maya felt the familiar sensation of being pulled in too many directions at once, the overwhelming pressure of everyone wanting something from her that she wasn't sure she could give. But before she could respond, the front door chimed and Elena Vasquez walked in, moving slowly with her walker, her thin frame wrapped in a coat that had seen better decades. "Excuse me," Elena said to Tony, her voice carrying the formal politeness of someone who'd learned to be careful in unfamiliar spaces. I'm looking for Maya Rodriguez. I heard she works here. Tony beamed and pointed toward the kitchen. She's right there, senora. Maya, someone here to see you. Maya emerged from the kitchen, and Alanda's face transformed with recognition and something deeper. Hope, maybe, or the kind of relief that came from finally finding someone who might understand. I had to come, Alana said simply. I had to see for myself. Everyone in my building, we heard the news. You're really her? The girl who owns all those apartments now? I'm really her, Maya said, moving closer and automatically adjusting her pace to Alana's careful steps. Mrs. Vasquez, right? Brighton Beach? I'm so sorry about what happened to your home. Alana's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I brought you something, she said, reaching into a worn purse and withdrawing a small envelope. These are pictures of my apartment before they bought the building, before they let everything fall apart to make us leave. I want you to see what they took from us. The photographs were printed on drugstore photo paper, slightly faded but clear enough to tell a story. Elena's apartment had been small but immaculate, every surface carefully tended, family photos arranged with a precision that came from loving curation. There were pictures of birthday parties and holiday celebrations, of children and grandchildren gathered around a kitchen table, of a life lived fully within walls that had represented safety and belonging. 47 years I lived there, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I raised my kids there after my husband died. I know every neighbor, every shop owner, every person who walked those streets. Then they come with their papers and their lawyers, and suddenly nothing I build there matters anymore. Maya studied the photographs, each one representing not just a physical space, but an entire ecosystem of relationships, traditions, and shared history that had been dismantled in service of someone's profit margin. She thought about Marcus's dismissive comments about market forces and business necessities, the way he'd reduced Elena's displacement to an inevitable cost of progress. Mrs. Vasquez, Maya said carefully, if I could find a way to get you back into your neighborhood, would you want that, even if it meant a different apartment, a new start? Elena's laugh was sharp with bitter experience. Mija, you know what those apartments cost now? They take my old place and they charge 3 times what I was paying for half the space. Beautiful young couples move in. They think they're getting a deal because it's still cheaper than Manhattan. They don't know the history, don't care about the people who were there before. But what if the apartments were still affordable, Maya pressed? What if there was housing specifically for people who'd been displaced at rents you could actually pay? Elena studied Maya's face, searching for the telltale signs of well-meaning condescension that usually followed conversations like this. But whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. Then yes, Mija, I would come home. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more visitors. Word was spreading through networks Maya was only beginning to understand. Tenant organizations, community advocacy groups, informal coalitions of people who'd been fighting Thornfield Industries long before Maya knew the company existed. By noon, Romano's had become an impromptu community center, filled with people who had traveled from across the city to meet the woman who might have the power to change their lives. Miguel Santos arrived with his daughter Carmen, named after Maya's mother, though the two families had never met. Miguel's restaurant might have closed, but he carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd built something meaningful, even if it had been taken away. I don't come here to ask for my restaurant back, he said, his English careful but confident. What's done is done. But I come to ask, what are you going to do different? How do we know you won't just be another rich person making promises until you don't need our votes anymore? It was a fair question, and Maya recognized the hard-earned skepticism behind it. Miguel probably sat through community meetings where politicians and developers had made similar promises, had watched gentrification marketed as revitalization, while his neighbors were priced out of their own lives. I don't know if you can trust me yet, Maya said honestly. I haven't done anything to earn that trust, except exist and inherit something I didn't ask for. But I can tell you what I'm planning to do, and then you can judge me by whether I actually follow through. She moved to the center of the restaurant, where 23 people had somehow managed to fit into a space designed for maybe 15 customers. They represented a cross-section of New York's working class,
elderly tenants on fixed incomes, young families struggling to afford rent, small business owners who'd been displaced by rising commercial rents, community organizers who'd been fighting losing battles against corporate landlords for years.
First, Maya said, her voice carrying the authority she'd discovered in herself over the past week, we're going to stop all evictions and rent increases immediately, pending a comprehensive review of every property in the Thornfield Industries portfolio. No one gets displaced while we figure out a better way to do business. Murmurs of approval rippled through the room, but Maya could see the skepticism remaining. Promises were easy, but implementation was hard. Second, we're going to establish a community advisory board made up of tenants, small business owners, and neighborhood representatives. No major decisions about any property get made without input from the people who actually live and work there. Jennifer Kim, the nurse who'd been forced to move to Queens, raised her hand tentatively. That sounds good in theory, but how do we know you won't just ignore the advisory board when it's inconvenient? How do we know this isn't just public relations? Because the advisory board will have actual power, Maya replied. Not just the ability to make recommendations, but the authority to veto developments that don't serve community interests. And because I'm going to put that authority in writing, in legally binding agreements that can't be changed without community consent. David Kim shifted uncomfortably beside her. They hadn't discussed this level of power sharing, and Maya could see him already calculating the legal complexities involved. But she pressed on, driven by the faces around her and the weight of responsibility that had been growing heavier each day. Third, we're going to prioritize affordable housing and small business development. Not just luxury condos with a token number of affordable units, but housing that working families can actually afford. Commercial spaces that support local entrepreneurs instead of forcing them out. "And how you going to pay for all this?" asked Carlos Mendoza, the mechanic whose auto shop had been priced out of Washington Heights. "You talk about affordable rent and community control, but buildings cost money to maintain. Property taxes don't go down because you want to be nice. If you can't make money, you can't keep the buildings running." It was the question Maya had been wrestling with since she'd first understood the scope of her inheritance. Traditional real estate investment was based on maximizing rents and minimizing expenses, extracting as much profit as possible from each property. But what if there were other models, other ways to measure success and sustainability? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "You're right that buildings cost money to maintain," she said, "but Thornfield Industries has been profitable for decades, and most of that profit has gone to shareholders and executive compensation, not back into the properties or the communities they serve. If we run the business more efficiently, if we measure success by community stability instead of just shareholder returns, we can afford to charge fair rents and still maintain the buildings properly." Elena Vasquez had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of experience that came from surviving decades of economic uncertainty. "Mija, I believe you mean what you say, but you know what happens. You make these changes, you help people like us, and then other rich people get angry. They find ways to make trouble for you, to make your life difficult, until you give up or sell out. How do you fight that?" It was the question Maya kept awake at night, the one that made her stomach clench with anxiety every time she thought about the scale of what she was attempting. Marcus Thornfield wasn't going to accept defeat quietly, and he represented just one part of a much larger system designed to protect concentrated wealth and resist redistribution. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "I'm one person with one company trying to change systems that have been in place for generations. But I'm not doing this alone. Every person in this room has been fighting these battles in your own ways, in your own neighborhoods. Maybe now we can fight them together with actual resources and legal authority behind us." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that held varying degrees of hope, skepticism, and desperate need. Finally, Miguel Santos stood up,
his daughter Carmen holding his hand as he prepared to speak. "Okay," he said simply. "I don't know if what you're saying is possible, but I know what we got now isn't working for people like us. So we try this. We work with you, we watch what you do, and we see if you are the person you say you are." One by one, others in the room began to nod, to voice their tentative agreement to be part of whatever Maya was trying to build. It wasn't enthusiastic endorsement. These were people who'd been disappointed before, who'd learned to protect themselves from hope that might be premature. But it was commitment, the kind of careful trust that had to be earned through actions rather than words.
As the informal gathering began to disperse, people exchanging contact information and making plans for follow-up meetings, Maya felt the full weight of what she'd just committed to. She'd made promises in front of witnesses, created expectations that would now follow her every decision, every compromise, every moment when doing the right thing conflicted with doing the profitable thing. Elena Vasquez was among the last to leave, moving slowly toward the door with the careful dignity that Maya was learning to associate with people who'd survived more than their share of disappointment. "Mija," Elena said, pausing at the threshold. "Your mama, she knew, didn't she? She knew what she was giving you wasn't just money." Maya nodded, understanding finally what Carmen Rodriguez had been preparing her for all those years of working multiple jobs, all those conversations about dignity and perseverance, and the difference between wealth and worth. "She knew," Maya replied. "She knew exactly what she was doing." After everyone had gone, Maya sat alone in Romano's with Tony, David Kim, and the weight of promises that would either transform how business could be done or destroy her in the attempt to honor them. The revolution had officially begun. 6 months later, Maya stood on the rooftop of what had once been the Thornfield Industries headquarters, now renamed Rodriguez Community Development Corporation. The building was the same 42 stories of glass and steel, but everything else had changed. Where Marcus's office had been a monument to corporate power, Maya had created a community meeting space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered the same commanding view of the city. But now that view was shared with tenant representatives, small business owners, and community organizers who helped guide every major decision. The transformation hadn't been easy. Marcus had fought every change through lawsuits, media campaigns, and attempts to rally other real estate developers against what he called Maya's dangerous precedent of emotional decision-making. But Maya had learned something important about power. Once you understood how to wield it effectively, it became much harder for others to take it away. The first major test had come in September, when Marcus convinced 3 city council members to call for a public hearing about the financial viability of Maya's community-centered business model. He'd presented detailed analyses showing that reduced rents and increased maintenance spending would bankrupt the company within 2 years, leaving thousands of tenants without housing and hundreds of employees without jobs. Maya had arrived at City Hall with a different set of numbers, prepared by a team of economists and community development experts who'd been studying alternatives to traditional real estate investment for decades. She'd shown how stable, affordable housing actually increased property values over time by creating the kind of neighborhood stability that attracted long-term investment. She'd presented data from other cities where community-controlled development had revitalized entire districts without displacing existing residents. But more importantly, she'd brought Elena Vasquez, Miguel Santos, Jennifer Kim, and dozens of other community members whose lives had already begun to change. They'd testified about what it meant to have affordable housing, about the small businesses that were reopening because commercial rents were no longer predatory, about children who didn't have to change schools because their families could afford to stay in their neighborhoods. The hearing had stretched for 6 hours, with Marcus and his supporters presenting ever more complex financial projections, while Maya's coalition told human stories that made those projections irrelevant. By the end, even the council members who'd been skeptical were asking how they could replicate the Rodriguez model in other parts of the city. Now, looking over a New York skyline that was slowly beginning to change, Maya could see the tangible results of 6 months of careful, community-centered work. In Brighton Beach, Elena Vasquez had moved into a new apartment just 3 blocks from her old one in a building that Rodriguez Community Development had purchased and renovated with input from a tenant council that Elena now chaired.
The apartment was larger than her old one, with updated plumbing and heating, but the rent was 30% less than what Thornfield Industries had been charging. In Washington Heights, Miguel Santos hadn't reopened his auto repair shop, but he'd partnered with Rodriguez Community Development to create a workforce training program that taught automotive skills to young people in the neighborhood while providing affordable car repair services to residents. His daughter, Carmen, now 16, was learning both sides of the business, the mechanical skills from her father and the community development aspects from Maya's team. Jennifer Kim had been able to move back to Manhattan into a nurse-designated affordable housing unit that kept her close to Mount Sinai Hospital while allowing her to save money for her daughter's college fund. She'd also become part of the Healthcare Workers Advisory Committee that was helping Rodriguez Community Development understand how housing policy affected the city's essential workers. The changes weren't just individual success stories. Entire neighborhoods were experiencing what residents were calling a reverse gentrification. The return of working families, the reopening of small businesses that served local communities rather than just tourists, the restoration of the kind of street-level economic diversity that made neighborhoods resilient and vibrant. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from David Kim. "Marcus wants to meet. Says he has a proposal you need to hear. Conference room B in 10 minutes?" Maya sighed, checking her watch. She had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since Forbes had published a cover story calling her the CEO who's redefining capitalism, and the Harvard Business Review had asked her to write about community-centered development as a sustainable business model.
Marcus's legal challenges had been failing. His media campaign had backfired, and his attempts to organize other developers against her had mostly resulted in increased interest in the Rodriguez model. She took the elevator down to Conference Room B, the same space where Marcus had tried to intimidate her 6 months earlier. Now it felt like a different universe. The walls covered with photos from community meetings and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the table surrounded by chairs that were usually occupied by tenant representatives and small business owners rather than corporate lawyers. Marcus was waiting for her, but he looked like a different person. The arrogant confidence had been replaced by something closer to desperation, his expensive suit somehow seeming less impressive, his carefully styled hair showing gray roots that suggested he'd been too distracted to maintain his usual grooming standards. "Maya," he said, standing as she entered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." The formality was jarring after months of legal battles and public confrontations. Maya took a seat across from him, curious about what kind of proposal could have brought Marcus to request a private meeting after everything that had happened between them. "I want to buy back into the company," he said without preamble, "not as CEO, not as majority owner. As a junior partner, learning from what you've built." Maya blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "I've been watching what you've done over the past 6 months. The financial reports, the community impact assessments, the media coverage. Your approach shouldn't work. By every traditional business metric, you should have failed by now. But you're not just succeeding, you're thriving. Your properties have lower vacancy rates than comparable buildings. Your maintenance costs have actually decreased because tenants take better care of spaces they feel ownership over. And your employee satisfaction scores are the highest in the industry." He paused, seeming to gather himself for what came next. "More than that, you've created something I never understood was possible. A business that makes money by making people's lives better, rather than by extracting value from their desperation." Maya studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning, but what she saw looked like genuine humility, the expression of someone who'd had their fundamental assumptions about the world challenged and found them wanting. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why now, and why do you think I would trust you with any role in what we're building?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photographs covering the conference room walls, images of ribbon cuttings and community meetings, and families moving into affordable apartments. 3 weeks ago, I got evicted from my own apartment. After the company stock became worthless and the lawsuits drained my savings, I couldn't make rent on the luxury condo I had been living in. The landlord was polite but firm. Market rate rent or 30 days to vacate. Maya felt a flicker of surprise, followed by something that might have been sympathy. She'd known that Marcus had lost his executive position and his family wealth when her ownership had been confirmed, but she hadn't thought about what that meant for his day-to-day life. I ended up in a studio apartment in Queens. Thin walls, inconsistent heat, a neighbor who works night shifts and has to sleep during the day. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing what most of my tenants had always lived with, the stress of housing insecurity, the constant worry about rent increases, the feeling of being powerless in the face of landlords who see you as nothing more than a revenue stream. He looked up at Maya, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of discovering that the safety net he had always assumed was there had never actually existed. I spent 42 years thinking that people like Elena Vasquez and Miguel Santos were just unlucky, or that they hadn't worked hard enough to deserve better. I thought the system was fair because it had always worked for me. But the system didn't work for me. It just protected me from ever having to test whether I could actually survive in the world I helped create for everyone else. Maya leaned back in her chair, processing this confession. Part of her felt vindicated. Marcus was finally understanding what she had tried to tell him 6 months ago about the human cost of treating housing as a commodity rather than a human right. But a larger part felt the complicated compassion that came from watching someone's worldview collapse and rebuild itself in real time. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I want to work for you. Not as an executive, not as someone with authority over other people's lives, as an employee who learns how to do real estate development that serves communities instead of exploiting them. I have knowledge about construction, about zoning regulations, about financing mechanisms that could be useful if they're applied differently. But I need to learn how to use that knowledge in service of something other than maximum profit extraction." Maya considered the proposal, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. Marcus understood the technical aspects of real estate development in ways that could accelerate the work she was trying to do, but he also represented everything that was wrong with the industry she was trying to transform, and his presence could undermine the trust she'd spent 6 months building with community partners.
"If I were to consider this," she said carefully, "it would have to be on terms that protect the community relationships we've built. You'd report to Elena Vasquez as part of the Tenant Advisory Board. Your work would be subject to review by people whose lives have been affected by the decisions you made as CEO, and your salary would be the same as any other entry-level community development associate, $38,000 a year." Marcus nodded without hesitation. "I understand. I'm not looking for charity or special treatment. I'm looking for the opportunity to learn how to do work that actually matters." The conversation continued for another hour, working through the practical details of what Marcus's role might look like, how his integration into the community development team would be managed, how success would be measured in terms of community impact rather than traditional business metrics. As they talked, Maya found herself thinking about her mother, about the choices Carmen had made to invest in a struggling young company rather than seeking immediate returns. Carmen had believed in the possibility of business as a force for community building rather than community destruction, and she'd been willing to bet her family's financial security on that belief. Now, Maya was faced with a similar choice, whether to invest in the possibility that even someone like Marcus Thornfield could learn to use privilege and knowledge in service of justice rather than exploitation. "Okay," she said finally. "We'll try a 6-month probationary period. You'll work directly with community advisory boards to understand the impact of past policies and help develop better approaches. Elena Vasquez will be your direct supervisor, and your continued employment will depend on whether the people most affected by your previous decisions Believe you're genuinely committed to change." Marcus's relief was visible, his shoulders dropping as if he'd been holding tension for months. "Thank you. I know I don't deserve this opportunity, but I promise I won't waste it." After he left, Maya sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by photographs that documented 6 months of careful, community-centered transformation. The work was far from finished. There were still dozens of buildings in the portfolio that needed renovation, hundreds of families waiting for affordable housing, countless small businesses looking for commercial spaces they could actually afford. But for the first time since inheriting her mother's unexpected legacy, Maya felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something sustainable, something that could outlive her own involvement and continue serving communities for generations to come. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Elena Vasquez. "Mija, I heard about the meeting with Marcus. You sure about this? Some of us remember what he put us through. But if you think people can change, I trust your judgment. See you at the community meeting Thursday." Maya smiled, feeling the weight of that trust and the responsibility it carried. Elena had every reason to be skeptical about Marcus's transformation, but she was willing to give Maya the benefit of the doubt because of the relationship they'd built over months of difficult, honest conversations about community development and economic justice. The evening light was fading outside the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the photographs that documented so much change in such a short time. Maya gathered her things and prepared to head home to her apartment above Romano's, where she still lived, despite being able to afford something much larger and more luxurious. The small space kept her grounded, connected to the neighborhood that had become her community, and the daily rhythms of working people whose lives were affected by every decision she made. As she waited for the elevator, Maya thought about the conversation she'd had with her mother's ghost. Not literally, but the internal dialogue she carried on with Carmen's memory whenever she faced difficult decisions. What would her mother think about giving Marcus Thornfield a second chance? What would she say about the balance between justice and mercy, between holding people accountable and believing in their capacity to change? Carmen had been a woman of fierce convictions, but also deep compassion. Someone who'd fought for her family's survival while never losing sight of their humanity, or the humanity of people who'd made her life harder. She'd taught Maya that the most radical act was sometimes the decision to see possibility where others saw only past failures. The elevator arrived, and Maya rode down 42 floors, past offices where community development specialists worked with tenant organizations to plan building improvements, past conference rooms where small business owners met with financial advisors to develop sustainable growth strategies, past meeting spaces where residents gathered to discuss neighborhood concerns and celebrate shared victories. When she reached the street, the city felt different than it had 6 months earlier. Not just because Maya's perspective had changed, but because the community relationships she'd built had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the buildings Rodriguez Community Development owned and operated. Other landlords were beginning to adopt tenant advisory boards, recognizing that community involvement led to more stable properties and higher tenant satisfaction. City officials were consulting with Maya's team about zoning changes that would support affordable housing development. Even some of the corporate developers who'd initially opposed her approach were quietly reaching out to learn about community-centered business models.
The walk home took her through neighborhoods where the changes were visible in small but meaningful ways. Storefronts that had been empty for years were reopening as community-supported businesses. Families were gathering in pocket parks that had been neglected under previous management but were now maintained through partnerships between residents and the development corporation. Children were playing on streets that felt safer because neighbors knew each other again, because economic stability had allowed people to invest in their communities rather than constantly searching for more affordable places to live. Maya paused outside Santos Auto Training Center, where Miguel Santos was locking up after an evening class. Through the windows, she could see young people learning skills that would allow them to support their families while serving their community. Miguel's daughter Carmen was there too, now 17 and already talking about studying business administration so she could help expand the program to other neighborhoods. "Maya," Miguel called out, jogging over with the energy of someone who'd found purpose again after loss. "Perfect timing. I wanted to tell you, we got the grant. The city approved funding for 3 more training centers in Brooklyn and the Bronx. We're going to be able to help so many more families." Maya felt the familiar warmth that came from watching other people's dreams become reality, knowing that her role had been to create conditions where those dreams could flourish rather than imposing her own vision of what success should look like. "That's incredible, Miguel. How does it feel to know that your idea is going to reach hundreds more young people?" Miguel's smile was radiant, but then his expression grew more serious. "It feels like responsibility, you know? Like we have to make sure we do this right, that we don't lose sight of why we started. Success can change people, make them forget where they came from." It was a concern Maya understood intimately. The media attention, the speaking engagements, the requests from other cities to consult on community development projects, all of it carried the risk of separating her from the daily realities of the people she was supposed to be serving. "How do we make sure that doesn't happen?" she asked. "We keep coming home," Miguel said simply. "We keep living in the neighborhoods we're trying to help. We keep listening to the people who trusted us when we had nothing to offer but promises. And we remember that all of this," he gestured toward the training center, toward the revitalized street, toward the broader transformation taking place around them, "all of this belongs to the community, not to us." As Maya continued toward home, Miguel's words echoed in her mind. The success of Rodriguez community development wasn't her personal achievement, it was the result of hundreds of people choosing to believe in the possibility of something better and working together to build it. Her role had been to provide resources and coordination, but the vision, the commitment, and the daily work of transformation belonged to Elena Vasquez and Miguel Santos and Jennifer Kim and Tony Romano and all the other community members who'd chosen to invest their time and energy in collective change. Romano's was still open when she arrived, the warm glow from the windows spilling onto the sidewalk where a few customers sat at outdoor tables enjoying the mild evening. Tony waved from behind the counter, where he was preparing fresh pasta for the dinner rush. His grandson Marco, now 13, was helping with orders, learning the family business while also studying community development through a youth leadership program that Rodriguez Community Development had helped establish. "Maya, come eat," Tony called out. "I made your favorite, the penne arrabbiata with extra cheese the way your mama used to like it." I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast, too focused on meetings and planning sessions to pay attention to my own basic needs. I took a seat at the counter, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells that had become home over the past 14 months. As Tony prepared my meal, other customers began to recognize me and offer greetings. Mrs. Chen from next door stopped by to share news about her grandson's acceptance to college on a scholarship partially funded by Rodriguez Community Development's Education Initiative. Carlos Mendoza updated me on the community garden that was being established in a vacant lot the company had purchased and turned over to resident management. Each conversation was brief but meaningful, part of the web of relationships that made my work feel rooted in real human connections rather than abstract policy goals. She was still Maya Rodriguez, the woman who served tables and remembered customers' orders and listened to people's stories over coffee and shared meals. But now she was also someone with the resources to help turn those stories into systemic change. Her phone buzzed with an email from Harvard Business School inviting her to speak at their annual conference on social entrepreneurship. The invitation was flattering, and Maya knew the platform could help spread awareness about community-centered business models to a new generation of business leaders. But she also knew the risks of becoming too removed from the day-to-day work, too focused on talking about change rather than continuing to create it. She made a mental note to discuss the speaking opportunity with the Community Advisory Board.
to let the people most affected by her work help decide whether external visibility served their interests or simply served Maya's growing reputation.
As she finished her meal, Elena Vasquez arrived for their weekly planning meeting, moving with the careful dignity that Maya had come to associate with people who'd survived more than their share of disappointment, but hadn't lost their capacity for hope. "Mija," Elena said, settling into the chair beside Maya's, "I've been thinking about this Marcus situation. I don't trust him. How could I? But I've been thinking about your mama, about the stories you tell about how she saw possibilities in people that others couldn't see." Maya nodded, remembering Carmen's tendency to hire employees that other businesses had given up on, to invest in relationships that seemed risky but often became the most reliable. "If we're going to let him try," Elena continued, "we do it our way. He reports to me, like you said, but also to Miguel and to Jennifer and to some of the other people whose lives he made harder. He doesn't get to hide behind corporate policies or legal language. He has to face what his decisions cost real families, and he has to prove every day that he's learned something from that." Maya felt a surge of gratitude for Elena's wisdom, for the way she balanced accountability with the possibility of redemption. It was exactly the kind of community-centered approach that had made Rodriguez Community Development successful, refusing to accept harm while also refusing to give up on people's capacity to change. "How do we measure whether it's working?" Maya asked. Elena's smile was sharp with experience. "Same way we measure everything else, by whether people's lives get better. If Marcus helps us build more affordable housing, if he helps small businesses find good commercial spaces, if he learns to listen to community voices instead of just talking over them, then maybe he's changing. If not, he's out." They spent the next hour planning Thursday's community meeting, reviewing proposals for 3 new affordable housing developments, and discussing the expansion of the Small Business Incubator program. Each decision was weighed not just in terms of financial sustainability, but in terms of community impact, long-term neighborhood stability, and the voices of residents who would be most affected. As Elena prepared to leave, she paused at the restaurant's door, looking back at Maya with an expression that mixed affection, pride, and continued watchfulness. "You know what your mama would say if she could see all this?" Elena asked. Maya shook her head, curious. "She'd say you found the secret, that real wealth isn't what you own, it's what you build with other people, and that the only power worth having is power you're willing to share." After Elena left, Maya sat alone in Romano's as Tony closed up for the night, the restaurant's warm lighting creating a bubble of intimacy against the city's endless energy. She thought about the secret Elena had identified, that individual success was meaningless unless it created conditions for collective flourishing, that business could be a tool for community building if it was approached with the right values and the right accountability structures. 6 months ago, she'd inherited a real estate empire built on extraction and displacement. Tonight, she was part of a community development network that was proving business could be both profitable and just, both successful and sustainable. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it was far from complete, but it was real, measurable, and growing stronger every day. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from using privilege and power in service of something larger than personal advancement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to honor her mother's sacrifice by building the kind of world Carmen Rodriguez believed was possible. The revolution was no longer just beginning. It was taking root, spreading, becoming the foundation for something that could outlast any individual leader and serve communities for generations to come. 3 years later, the headline in the Wall Street Journal read, "The Rodriguez Model Goes National: How Community-Controlled Development Became the Fastest-Growing Sector in Real Estate." Maya folded the newspaper and set it on her desk next to a photo of her mother that had become more precious with each passing year.
Carmen Rodriguez's warm smile seemed to approve of everything the office represented. Community meeting schedules pinned to bulletin boards, children's drawings from the after-school program taped to windows, and financial reports that measured success in families housed and small businesses supported rather than just quarterly profits. Elena Vasquez knocked on the open door, her walker replaced by a cane as her confidence in her new neighborhood had improved her physical health. At 86, she'd become the unofficial grandmother of the community development movement, traveling to Detroit and Cleveland and Oakland to help other communities establish their own tenant advisory boards. "Mija, you ready for the big announcement?" Elena asked, settling into the comfortable chair Maya kept specifically for their morning conversations. "As ready as anyone can be for something this big," Maya replied, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement and nervousness that came before major milestones. Today was the official launch of the Rodriguez Community Development Institute, a training program that would teach community-centered business practices to developers, urban planners, and community organizers from across the country.
The institute had grown from a simple idea that the transformation of Thornfield Industries could be replicated in other cities if people had access to the right knowledge, resources, and support networks. Over the past year, Maya's team had systematized their approach, creating curricula that balanced financial sustainability with community accountability, teaching others how to navigate the complex intersection of real estate law, community organizing, and sustainable business practices. "You nervous about the speech?" Elena asked, studying Maya's face with the perceptiveness that came from years of watching people navigate hope and disappointment. "A little," Maya admitted. "It's one thing to prove that this approach works in New York with specific communities and specific relationships. It's another thing to claim it can work everywhere, for everyone." Elena's laugh was warm with understanding. "Mija, you think too much like a business person sometimes. This isn't about having all the answers. It's about giving people the tools to find their own answers, the way we found ours." Through the office windows, Maya could see the courtyard where the press conference would be held, filled with folding chairs and media equipment. Representatives from 37 cities had come to New York to learn about community-controlled development, along with reporters from national publications and documentary crews that had been following the Rodriguez story since its beginning. But more importantly, the audience included dozens of community members who'd been part of the transformation over the past 3 years. Elena and Miguel and Jennifer, of course, but also newer voices like Marcus Thornfield, who'd become one of the program's most effective advocates after his own journey from corporate executive to community development specialist. Marcus's transformation had been slower and more difficult than Maya had anticipated. The first 6 months of his probationary period had been marked by struggles with his ingrained assumptions about tenant relations, his tendency to propose top-down solutions rather than community-driven ones, and his difficulty accepting criticism from people he'd once viewed as beneath his notice. But Elena Vasquez had been a patient and demanding supervisor, requiring Marcus to spend time in tenant meetings, to listen to stories of displacement and housing insecurity, to understand the human cost of the policies he'd once implemented without a second thought. Gradually, he'd begun to develop what Elena called community eyes, the ability to see neighborhood problems from the perspective of people who lived with their consequences rather than people who profited from their perpetuation. The breakthrough had come during his 8th month with the company, when Marcus had been working on a renovation project in the Bronx. The building had been neglected for years under previous ownership, with heating problems, plumbing failures, and structural issues that had been ignored because fixing them would have reduced short-term profits. Marcus had initially proposed the standard renovation approach: displace existing tenants temporarily, complete all upgrades at once, then allow residents to return at higher rents that would cover the improvement costs. It was efficient, cost-effective, and completely tone-deaf to the realities of working families who couldn't afford temporary housing or rent increases. Elena Vasquez had required him to attend a tenant meeting where residents explained why temporary displacement wasn't temporary for families living paycheck to paycheck, why rent increases of any size could force children to change schools and elderly people to leave communities where they'd built support networks over decades. Instead of defending his proposal, Marcus had listened. Really listened in a way he'd never done as CEO. And then he'd gone back to his team with a different approach. Fayed renovations that allowed tenants to remain in their apartments with temporary accommodations provided on-site when specific units needed work. Rent stabilization agreements that ensured improvements wouldn't price out existing residents. Community input on design decisions that affected shared spaces and neighborhood character. The project had taken longer and cost more than Marcus's original proposal, but the results had been transformative. Not just improved housing conditions, but stronger tenant relationships, lower vacancy rates, and a building that had become a model for community-centered renovation practices. That success had led to Marcus becoming a full-time employee, then a project manager, and eventually a community development specialist who worked with tenant organizations across the Rodriguez portfolio. His corporate background gave him credibility with traditional developers who were skeptical of community-centered approaches, while his personal experience of housing insecurity helped him connect with residents who had every reason to distrust people in positions of authority. Now, Marcus was scheduled to speak at the Institute launch, sharing his story as evidence that even the most entrenched systems could change when people were willing to do the difficult work of examining their assumptions and rebuilding their relationships with community.
Maya's phone buzzed with a text from David Kim, who'd become not just her lawyer, but the Institute's general counsel. Media is set up. Attendees are arriving. Miguel wants to know if you need anything before the presentation. Maya gathered her notes, though she'd long since stopped relying on formal speeches, preferring the organic conversation style that had made her community meetings so effective. She'd learned that authenticity was more powerful than polish, that admitting uncertainty was more trustworthy than claiming to have all the answers. The courtyard was buzzing with energy when Maya stepped outside, conversations mixing English and Spanish and other languages as community organizers, urban planners, and journalists tried to understand what they were witnessing. The diversity of the crowd reflected the movement's growth, not just the gentrification-fighting activists that Maya had expected, but suburban planners dealing with affordable housing shortages, rural developers looking for sustainable economic development models, and international observers studying American approaches to community-controlled business. Elena had taken her usual seat in the front row, flanked by Miguel Santos and his daughter Carmen, now 20 and studying urban planning at Columbia with a focus on community economic development. Jennifer Kim sat with a group of healthcare workers who'd become advocates for workforce housing after seeing how Maya's approach had stabilized their own lives and careers. In the back of the audience, Maya spotted faces she recognized from 3 years of media coverage and speaking engagements. The mayor of Detroit, who'd invited Rodriguez Community Development to consult on affordable housing policy. The community organizer from Oakland, who'd adapted their tenant advisory board model for California's different legal environment. The rural development specialist from North Carolina, who was working with farming communities to create cooperative business structures. But it was the front row that mattered most to Maya. The people whose trust had made everything else possible, who'd chosen to believe in change when they had every reason to expect disappointment. Maya stepped to the podium, looking out over an audience that represented 3 years of careful relationship building, systematic documentation, and the slow work of proving that business could serve community rather than exploiting it. 3.5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. I was working as a waitress at Romano's Italian Bistro, serving coffee and taking orders, and trying to figure out how to pay off student loans on minimum wage plus tips. I thought success meant finding a corporate job that would finally validate my college degree, finally prove that all my mother's sacrifices had been worth something,
She paused, meeting Elena's eyes and drawing strength from the older woman's steady presence. I was wrong about what success looked like, but I was right about one thing. My mother's sacrifices were worth something. They were worth everything. Because Carmen Rodriguez didn't just save money for my future. She invested in a vision of business that could build communities instead of destroying them, that could create wealth that served everyone instead of concentrating it in the hands of people who already had too much. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in a story many had heard pieces of, but never in its full context. The Rodriguez Community Development Institute exists because we've learned something important over the past 3 years. That community-controlled development isn't just an idealistic dream. It's a practical, profitable, scalable approach to business that creates better outcomes for everyone involved. Better housing stability for tenants, better returns for investors, better economic opportunities for small businesses, better neighborhood conditions for families. Maya clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing before and after photos of buildings in the Rodriguez portfolio. The changes weren't just about fresh paint and new fixtures. They were about spaces that felt cared for, about communities that had reclaimed agency over their own development. But we've also learned that this approach can't be imposed from the outside. It has to grow from authentic relationships between developers and communities, from business models that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term extraction, from leadership structures that share power rather than concentrating it. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, documenting not just the successes, but the failures, the conflicts, the ongoing challenges of balancing community needs with financial sustainability. Maya had learned that credibility came from acknowledging complexity rather than claiming simplistic solutions. When she finished, the questions came fast and challenging. A developer from Portland wanted to know how community advisory boards made decisions when residents disagreed with each other. An urban planner from Miami asked about scalability, whether the Rodriguez model could work in cities with different economic conditions, different regulatory environments, different community structures. Maya answered as honestly as she could, drawing on 3 years of experience, but acknowledging the limitations of that experience. Some questions she redirected to Elena or Miguel or other community members whose perspectives were more relevant than her own. But it was Marcus Thornfield's question that surprised everyone, including Maya.
"Miss Rodriguez," he said, standing in the middle of the audience with the kind of formal respect that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "You've talked about the importance of accountability structures, of making sure that people in positions of power remain connected to the communities they serve. As this movement grows, as you become a national figure with influence over policy and investment decisions, how do you maintain that accountability? How do you make sure you don't become disconnected from the daily realities of housing insecurity and economic displacement?" It was a question Maya had been wrestling with privately as speaking engagements and media interviews consumed more of her time, as requests for consultation and policy advice pulled her away from neighborhood meetings and tenant concerns. "It's the most important question you could ask," she replied, "because it's the question that will determine whether this movement stays true to its values or becomes another form of well-intentioned colonization." She looked around the audience, making eye contact with community members who'd entrusted her with their stories and their hopes. "The answer is that I can't maintain that accountability alone. It has to be built into the structures we create, the decision-making processes we establish, the ways we measure success and failure. Yelena Vasquez still reviews my work, still tells me when I'm making decisions that serve my ego rather than community needs. Miguel Santos still reminds me that sustainability means economic sustainability for working families, not just financial sustainability for businesses." Maya paused, feeling the weight of responsibility that had grown heavier with each expansion of the Rodriguez model. "But more than that, we have to remember that this institute, this movement, this entire approach to development, none of it belongs to me. It belongs to every person who chose to trust us with their housing, their businesses, their neighborhoods. My job is to create systems that can outlast my involvement, that can continue serving communities even if I make mistakes or lose sight of what matters most. The formal presentation ended, but conversations continued throughout the afternoon as participants broke into smaller groups, sharing challenges from their own communities, comparing strategies for tenant organizing and community financing, planning collaborations that would extend the Institute's reach into new regions and new approaches to community development. Maya found herself in a quiet corner of the courtyard with Yelena, watching the animated discussions that surrounded them. 3 years ago, the idea of community-controlled development seemed almost impossibly idealistic. Now it was being studied by business schools, implemented by municipal governments, and adapted by grassroots organizations that had never heard of Maya Rodriguez, but understood the principles that made the work successful. "You did good, mija," Yelena said, her voice soft with the kind of pride that came from watching someone honor their heritage while building something entirely new. "We did good," Maya corrected, understanding finally that individual achievement was meaningless without the collective work that made it possible. 5 years later. The documentary crew had been following Maya for 6 months, creating what the director called an intimate portrait of how social movements scale without losing their soul. Maya had been reluctant to agree to such extensive access, but Yelena had convinced her that documentation was important, that future community organizers needed to understand not just the policies and procedures, but the daily work of building trust, navigating conflicts, and maintaining hope in the face of systems designed to resist change. Maya sat in the same office where she'd planned the Institute launch, answering questions about the movement's expansion to 43 cities, the development of community-controlled housing policies in 8 states, and the establishment of the Rodriguez Fellowship Program, which brought community organizers and urban planning students together for a year-long residencies in neighborhoods implementing community development projects. "What surprised you most about how this work has evolved?" asked the documentary director, a young woman who'd been following community development movements across the country. Maya considered the question, looking around an office that had become a museum of relationship building. Photographs from ribbon cuttings and community meetings, children's drawings from the after-school programs, and letters from families who'd been able to stay in their neighborhoods because of stable, affordable housing. "I think what surprised me most is how much the work has taught me about hope. Not hope as wishful thinking, but hope as a practice, as something you create through daily actions and sustained relationships." She gestured toward a photograph of Yelena Vasquez speaking at a community meeting in Detroit, teaching tenant organizers about advisory board structures. Yelena was 89 now, still traveling, still learning, still insisting that real change happened through one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time. "When I inherited Thornfield Industries, I thought the challenge would be financial, how to run a profitable business without exploiting tenants and communities. But the real challenge has been emotional and spiritual, how to use power without being corrupted by it, how to scale impact without losing authenticity, how to build movements that can survive the imperfections of their leaders."
The interviewer nodded, making notes about themes that would weave through the documentary's narrative structure. "And Marcus Thornfield, his transformation has become almost as famous as your own. What's your relationship like now?" Maya smiled, thinking about the weekly coffee meetings she still had with Marcus. Conversations that had evolved from tense supervision to collaborative planning to something approaching friendship based on shared commitment to community development work. "Marcus teaches me that people can change, but only if they're willing to do the hard work of facing what their previous choices cost other people. He's become one of our most effective advocates precisely because he understands what community-controlled development is an alternative to. He knows intimately what extraction-based business does to neighborhoods and families, because he used to design and implement those policies." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But more than that, Marcus represents the possibility that this movement can reach people who seemed completely committed to maintaining the status quo. If someone with his background and his investment in traditional real estate practices can learn to prioritize community needs over profit maximization, then maybe the changes we're creating can be deeper and more sustainable than I originally imagined. The interview continued for another hour, covering topics that had become familiar from dozens of similar conversations: policy recommendations, replication challenges, the delicate balance between growth and maintaining community accountability. Maya had learned to navigate media attention without losing sight of the daily work that made everything else possible. After the crew left, Maya walked through the building that had once housed Thornfield Industries' corporate headquarters, but now served as the national headquarters for community development organizations, tenant advocacy groups, and small business incubators. The change wasn't just symbolic, it represented a fundamental shift in how space was used, how decisions were made, how success was measured. The 42nd floor still offered the same commanding view of New York City, but now that view was shared daily with community members, with tenant leaders, with young people learning about urban planning and economic development through fellowship programs that connected academic learning with grassroots organizing. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Carmen Santos, Miguel's daughter, who'd graduated from Columbia and was now directing community development projects in 3 South Bronx neighborhoods. "Tia Maya, we got the funding. The cooperative housing project is approved and will be able to house 47 families in permanently affordable units. Can't wait to tell you all the details at dinner tomorrow." The message filled Maya with the same satisfaction she'd felt 3 years earlier when Miguel had gotten his first grant, or 5 years earlier when Elena had moved back to Brighton Beach. Individual victories were meaningful, but the pattern of victories, the evidence that community-controlled development was becoming a reliable approach to neighborhood stability and economic justice, that was what sustained hope through the inevitable setbacks and disappointments. As evening lights slanted through the office windows, Maya prepared to walk home through neighborhoods that had been transformed not by her individual actions, but by the collective work of hundreds of people who'd chosen to believe that business could serve community rather than exploiting it. The walk took her past Santos Cooperative Training Center, where Miguel's workforce development program had expanded to include financial literacy, small business development, and community organizing skills. Past Elena Vasquez Memorial Gardens, the community space that elderly tenants had designed and young residents maintained as a living tribute to organizing and hope. Past Romano's Italian Bistro, where Tony's grandson Marco was now the manager, implementing business practices that supported both profitability and community development. Each stop along the way represented relationships that had been built carefully over years, trust that had been earned through consistent follow-through on commitments, change that had been created through the patient work of showing up every day with solutions rather than just complaints. Maya paused outside the building where she still lived, in the same apartment above Romano's bakery that had been her sanctuary during those first overwhelming weeks of understanding what her inheritance meant. She'd been offered larger spaces, more luxurious accommodations, apartments that would reflect her changed economic circumstances. But she had chosen to stay, partly for the practical reason that living in the community kept her connected to the daily realities of her work, and partly for the spiritual reason that home was about relationships rather than square footage or status symbols. Her phone rang as she climbed the familiar stairs, Elena Vasquez's name appearing on the screen. "Mija, you see the news from Oakland?" "Which news?" Maya asked, settling into her kitchen chair and reaching for the French press that still held price of place next to her mother's photograph. "The ballot measure passed. 67% of voters approved a community development authority. They'll have real power to control gentrification, to create affordable housing, to support small businesses that serve neighborhoods instead of just tourists." Maya felt the familiar rush of pride and possibility that came with each expansion of community-controlled development beyond New York. Each indication that the principles they developed could take root in different soil, different communities, different political and economic environments. "That's incredible," Maya said. "How did the organizing go? Were they able to build the kind of coalition we talked about?"
"Better than we talked about," Elena replied. "Tenant organizations, small business owners, teachers, healthcare workers, Even some developers who understand that community-controlled development can be more profitable than extraction-based approaches. They learned from our model, but they made it their own, adapted it to what Oakland needs, instead of just copying what worked in New York. Maya smiled, understanding that Elena's pride came not from seeing their approach replicated exactly, but from seeing it translated, adapted, made relevant to different communities with different histories and different challenges. You know what this means? Elena continued. It means the work your mama started, the investment she made in possibility rather than profit, it's growing into something bigger than any of us could have imagined. Community development that's controlled by communities, business models that create wealth for everyone instead of concentrating it for a few people, housing and economic policies that support families instead of displacing them. After Elena hung up, Maya sat in her small kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of a neighborhood that had become home not just to her, but to hundreds of families who might have been forced out if business had continued as usual. She thought about her mother, about the choices Carmen Rodriguez had made to save every penny, to invest in a struggling company rather than seeking immediate returns, to believe that her daughter's future could be built on something more substantial than individual advancement. Carmen had been dead for 8 years now, but her influence grew stronger rather than weaker as Maya understood more deeply what her mother had been trying to teach her, that real wealth came from community relationships, that meaningful success required lifting others up rather than climbing over them, that the most radical act was sometimes the decision to share power rather than hoarding it. Maya opened her laptop and began writing the weekly newsletter that went out to community development organizations across the country, a simple update on projects and policies that had become a crucial resource for organizers working on everything from tenant rights to cooperative business development. Dear friends and colleagues, this week brought news from Oakland that reminds us why this work matters and why it's continuing to spread. As she typed, Maya felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that connected daily actions to long-term change, individual relationships to systemic transformation. The newsletter was a small thing, just a few paragraphs of updates and encouragement sent to people she might never meet in person. But it was part of the infrastructure that allowed community-controlled development to remain connected to community-controlled values, that kept the movement grounded in the experiences of people whose lives were affected by housing policy and economic development decisions. When she finished writing, Maya closed the laptop and prepared for bed, following routines that had remained constant even as everything else in her life had changed. She was still Maya Rodriguez, daughter of Carmen Rodriguez, someone who understood that the most important work happened in daily interactions between people who chose to treat each other with dignity and respect. But she was also the founder of a movement that was proving business could be a force for justice, that community development could be controlled by communities, that wealth could be created in ways that served everyone rather than just the people who started with the most advantages.
I won't live to see how big this movement becomes, but I've seen enough to know it will outlast all of us. I've seen tenant organizations in 30 cities learn to negotiate with developers from positions of strength rather than desperation. I've seen young people like Carmen Santos grow up believing that business can serve community, that development doesn't have to mean displacement, that their voices matter in decisions about their neighborhoods. Most of all, I've seen you become the leader your mama knew you could be. Not someone who talks about change from comfortable distance, but someone who builds it through daily relationships with people who trust you with their dreams. The work isn't finished, mija. It never will be. But you've proven something important, that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable, when they choose community over individual advancement, when they remember that real wealth comes from what we build together. Keep showing up. Keep listening. Keep sharing power instead of hoarding it. The revolution your mama started with a single investment decision will continue long after both of us are gone, carried forward by people whose names we'll never know, but whose lives are better because someone believed that business could be a force for justice. Your mama would be so proud of who you became, and so am I. Con amor y esperanza, Elena. Maya folded the letter carefully, tears blurring her vision as she understood that an era was ending and another beginning. Maya passed peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by the chosen family she'd built through decades of organizing, her legacy woven into communities across the country where people continued the work of proving that another world was possible. At the memorial service, Maya spoke about inheritance, not just the money her mother had saved, but the values Elena had protected, the relationships they'd all built, the stubborn hope that had sustained them through every challenge. The revolution would continue, carried forward by people who understood that real change happened one community at a time, one relationship at a time, one act of shared power at a time. The work was far from finished. It never would be. But it was no longer dependent on any single person's strength or vision. It had become what Elena always said it needed to become, a movement that belonged to the communities it served, sustainable and self-renewing, rooted in the simple truth that everyone deserved dignity, stability, and the chance to build something better for their children.